over the next few weeks. I've titled it God's Strategy Through History. In the first part of this, we're going to look at history itself. And so there's a lot of information, so stick with me. We have a direction we're going, but in the middle of it, I want to make sure that we kind of all are up to speed, that we're informed, that we have a sense of the flow. There's so much in church history that I can't do just for the sake of time. I mean, we could do this for weeks and talk about a lot of the things that have happened in church history affect how we think today, what we do today, how we do things today. So when we look at a Christian view of history, it's a different point of view than necessarily what you get in school. I mean, school emphasizes certain things and church history will emphasize certain things. Sometimes we're under the illusion that certain things are what are the most. Look at our formation of the Declaration of Independence and American history and the Constitution and all the monumental, wonderful things that were accomplished in that, but often we disconnect it from the First Great Awakening and how much influence the First Great Awakening had on that God-fearing spirit that dominated America at that time. And so, which is more important? Well, one really can't be divorced from the other. I'm just giving you an example of how events of history sometimes are. For instance, I went to, was it the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., the Museum of History, and I went in there and they had all these fantastic just displays and examples, and then there was one little section on the Great Awakenings. First Great Awakening and Second Great Awakening. It had a couple graphs and a couple little pillars and a few little posters. And I thought, in this tiny little spot in this gigantic museum, and I'm like, they've got it all backwards. They don't understand where the priorities lay. And so that's why it's important for us to have maybe a broader feel. And you may look at kind of, so the way I put this together, these are things that maybe from my point of view, what I think are pivotal points in history. And I think that other people might teach church history a little differently than I would, but this is just how I've kind of hashed it out over many years of my own studies. And so you may think I emphasize something where somebody else might emphasize something else. And then also my theological worldview also filters through what I think is important and what I think isn't. So we just have to all understand that we have biases when we delve into history itself. It can be very elusive in many ways. So when we look at God's strategy through history, there's three things I want you to kind of grasp. And first of all, we're going to look at the first section, will be the rise of the early church. This was an amazing period of time. And so that'll be kind of our first section. It's a very short period relative to the last 2,000 years. The early church, when I refer to it, is referring to the first 300 years. Many people will refer to it more loosely, including the Constantinian period and so forth. And then it gets really rough. It gets really dark for a period of time, hence the term the Dark Ages. I don't like that term, but I do think there's part of history that is really pretty dark, and there are reasons for it. But no matter how dark, there's always a remnant. That's what you have to remember. And so the third part of it is the sequential restoration of the church. And so I believe that occurs over the last 500 to 600 years, where God is moving sequentially and strategically and methodically to restore the church for eventually the second coming. So we're going to look at, this is how I'm breaking down the historical periods. So 30 to 314, 30 being approximating the resurrection, the ministry of Jesus, to 314, which would be the first 284 years of church history. We'll call that the early church. That's prior to the reign of Constantine. And then we have 314 to 500. That would be the rise of the Catholic Church. Okay? There's a great morphing and a shifting that takes place over the next several hundred years after Constantine. And then we have the early Middle Ages, 500 to 100. Some people just refer to that as the Middle Ages, but I'm just calling it the early part of the Middle Ages. And then 1000 to 1500, historians would refer to this period as the High Middle Ages. 1500 to 1700, I'm calling, in this case, the late Middle Ages or the period of the Reformation. And then finally we have the 1700 to 1900s, and I've kind of broken that into its own category. It's a very profound category of the Great Awakenings and revivals that just happen in the most methodical way. And by the way, we're due. We're way overdue. So when I talk about revivals and awakenings, I'm talking about historical revival. I'm talking about widespread geographical awakenings. There's always been pockets of profound things that God is doing, sometimes even in an individual church, in a community, and so forth. But what we're talking about is something that shakes the roots of history. So when we talk about a revival in a historical sense, that's what I mean. So, historic milestones in church history. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to start going through this point by point. I don't have a script, so I'm just going to kind of talk from the hip as we go through these. That's a lot right there. That's just one page. I've got a whole lot of pages. Oh, by the way, probably about everybody is here already, so if we could go ahead and hand these out. This is a synopsis of the screens that are about to flash by you that will overwhelm you in a moment. So you have this. You can take it home and study it. This one, if somebody can hand these out, this one is the controversial one that's it could upset somebody, but it's just the truth. So it doesn't matter how upset somebody gets. If you could give me a copy of the Catholic one. Yeah, that one. There's 30, so there's enough for everybody here. All right, so when you look at this, I'm going to preface this. You're getting the handout here. It's the False Doctrines instituted by the Roman Catholic Church. And what it does is it documents point by point. Every year they introduce something that was not biblical, something that became part of church tradition. And so when you look at this, I want you to see how consistent, and then look at how it accumulates over time. So as we go through church history, I want you to see at the same time, all this stuff is happening. They're instituting all these different policies, which eventually led to what we just saw, the little clip of Martin Luther, which eventually led many of the things on this list were in his 95 Theses, right? Many of them were on that list. So there were excesses, there were things that were just off, they were wrong. And so a number of people began to object, at risk of death, by the way. So we start 30 AD, the crucifixion of Jesus, which 30 to 33 AD approximately. And then we have the early church, we have the New Testament period, and they have 64 AD. This is when Nero blames the burning of Rome on the Christians, and this is the first widespread Roman persecution. A systematic persecution of Christians began in 64 AD. It's believed on the tail of that is when Paul lost his head. So that would have occurred in approximately 66 AD. Paul being beheaded because he was a Roman citizen. He had a more merciful death, if you will. So as we progress, soon after that, we see the siege, the Jewish rebellion against Rome. This was a really big deal. And I know Rome had many conflicts over many years, and they would take over all kinds of people groups and nations, and I mean, they were a machine. But in about 66 to 70 AD, the Roman destruction of Jerusalem took place. They destroyed the temple, and Christians, however, during that time, they refused to be a part of the Zealot rebellion. And they also, when they saw the army surrounding Jerusalem, they took that and they said, this sounds a lot like what Jesus was warning us about, and to head for the hills. And that's exactly what they did. So by and large, the Christians in the siege of Jerusalem were by and large not present. It was just the pagans and the zealots and the radicals left to themselves, and they had a very, very profound battle with Rome, and it was gruesome, it was merciless, it was destructive, it was almost beyond comprehension, the amount of death on both sides that occurred. But Rome seems to have unlimited resources, and so it's just a matter of time over time where they just are going to wear them down. But the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple really changed a lot of things. And it also was fulfilled by Jesus' prophecy when he said there won't be a stone remaining on this building. When they're looking, they're so impressed with the Herod's temple. And look at this. And Jesus saying, hey, don't be too impressed. This is all coming down. And so it all came down, really within that generation. He said, this generation will not pass away until these things are fulfilled. So it was within their lifetime, many of them that were watching and listening to him prophesy. So the Christians, one of the things that shifted in the early church at this time was that they had always been looked at as a sect of the Jews. They were kind of an oddball group, but they were still kind of lumped as Jewish people. They were they were often meeting in synagogues. They were often mixed with the Jewish people because most of the Christians were Jewish. Now, the Gentile message had been getting out, and Paul and Peter and all these guys were involved in that, and many, many thousands of Gentiles were beginning to come to the Lord. But nonetheless, it all started in Israel, among the Jews. And so with this destruction, one of the things that happened to the early church is the separation began to take place. A distinction began to take place between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. It wasn't complete yet, but you have to realize how integrated they were for quite a while. And that was one of the things you read through the New Testament. You can see that kind of struggle. We're Jewish. We don't want to mix with Gentiles. And so they saw themselves as more Jewish for a while than they saw themselves as Christians. But all that is changing with the destruction of Jerusalem. So, and then you've all heard of the story of Masada. That happens a few years later. Another incredible, I've been to Masada, it's another incredible, but really Christians had nothing to do with this. They had no part. Again, they were not participating in these rebellions against Rome. And then we can fast forward from there. Now, some scholars will speculate the end of the apostolic era is 100 AD, meaning that by then we know that all the apostles were dead. The original 12, the original 11, they were all dead by this time. Now, there's a debate that goes on as to, is it 100 AD or is it more like 68 or 69 AD? I have begun to be persuaded that the last apostle died probably in more like 68 or 69 AD, or that the last book of the Bible was written then. I've begun to believe that all of the entire New Testament was completed by the destruction of Jerusalem, by the destruction of the Romans. And the reason is because there are certain references in the New Testament that seem to allude to the continued existence of the physical temple. It's not real clear, and that's why there's debate. But I think it was such a monumental shift that it's really incredible to think that all these writers, New Testament writers, are writing about the history of Israel and referencing the Old Testament and referencing the temple and all these different things, and never actually reference its destruction. It's almost hard for us to imagine. When you go to Jerusalem and you go to the Wailing Wall and they go and they're sitting there, they're looking at the remaining foundation of the temple square. And they're deep, big, giant stones and things that are still there, but they're more the undergirding foundation of what was once. But they didn't just level the temple, they leveled the entire city. That's why when you go there and you walk Via Dolorosa and all that, it's not Via Dolorosa. All these streets and things have all been rearranged. It's, and our tour guide explained that to me, much to my distress. And you see all these people marching along in these different stations and they're doing this. And so he explained to me that all of this has changed. It's all rearranged. And so it's an approximation maybe, right? So I think that the entire New Testament, including the book of Revelation, was completed prior to 70 AD, was destruction of Jerusalem. So the next thing that happens, so the church goes on. And it has scatterings of persecution. But by and large, the Romans, even some of the Roman generals and tribunes, to some extent didn't want to really mess with the Jews or the Christians. It's volatile. They don't want to. So to some extent, sometimes they were almost protective, like in Antioch and other places, where they would just say, no, we're just going to leave it. We're not going to mess with it. But eventually, the Jewish revolt rises again in 133 to 135 AD. I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they raise an entire army of tens of thousands of Jewish rebels, but they go after the Romans again. and the Romans smashed them to smithereens again. They say that 580,000 Jews died in that confrontation. 135 AD. Once again, the Christians refused to be a part. You have to remember, there were Christians that were members of the Roman army. There were Christians who were coexisting by this time with the Roman legions. And some of them were commanders. Some of them were converted to Christ. So you have to understand, where they're willing to serve in the Roman army, they were not willing to serve with the zealots. And there are probably a lot of reasons for that, but one is the zealots were cold-blooded killers. And so in 135 AD, they were smashed again. The man that was running this thing is named Bar Kokhba. He was ruthless, and he considered the Christian sect an enemy of the Jews. And so the zealots, persecuted the Christians because they would not participate. And so they persecuted, so their fellow Jewish countrymen were persecuting them because they would not participate in the rebellion against Rome. Really interesting. But again, it was devastating. And at that point, from that point forward, 135 AD, the Romans made a decision: no Jew is allowed in Jerusalem indefinitely. Renamed the city, and they included Christians. Said no Christians, no Jews, no nobody. It's just left in rubble and ruins. They tried to rebuild it with a Roman emphasis. So this was the true great diaspora. You see that reference sometimes in the New Testament. There were always Jews all over the Mediterranean world. But this was the final disbursement of the Jewish people. They no longer had a homeland. They no longer had anybody, even though there may be pockets in the Holy Land where they lived. But by and large, as a population, if they weren't wiped out by the Romans, they were dispersed all over the world, all over the Mediterranean world. And that is the great diaspora. And the Christians were also distributed with that same period. So it's a really interesting period. So then from then on, you had certain Roman emperors that would come in that were unfriendly to Christians, and then certain ones that were fine with Christians. And that would kind of go on and off. It's not like they experienced continuous persecution, and it's not like they experienced empire-wide persecution. There would be pockets, right, where they were in trouble, and they could sometimes dodge around that. But there were some persecutions that were particularly ruthless. The last one, which was the persecution of Diocletian, was in 303 to 311 AD. And Diocletian was ruthless, and this was an empire-wide persecution. It was one of those things where you can't buy or sell unless you take the mark kind of thing. I mean, it was just absolutely the torture and the killings and the entertainment and the ring, all of these things were, I mean, Nero was bad. But Nero was so bad his own people killed him off. I mean, you have to remember, some of these guys, I mean, Nero was distasteful to his own leadership. They took him out, okay? Diocletian had, he had about 9 years of, awful, horrible period. And the other thing that was so sad about Diocletian is that he systematically destroyed every ancient document, every ancient scripture he could get his hands on. And they would get people to turn each other in. They would get people to betray each other. It was just really, really ugly. And a lot of Christians were turning on each other. It was really awful. And that's what they did. That's what happened. So meanwhile, a general named Constantine, the empire was split with two generals, and they got in a battle. Constantine has a vision from the Lord, supposedly, allegedly. And in the vision, he saw them with these crosses on their shields. And that if they would do this, they would have victory. And so Constantine won the battle. And he claimed at least affection for Christianity. Nobody really knows. People speculate, was he really a believer or was he not a believer? But he became an ally of the Christian faith. And so finally, Christianity. And so what happened is they had a Edict of Milan that was issued by Constantine that decriminalized Christianity. He did not make Christianity the official religion of Rome. All he did was say it's no longer a crime to be a Christian. And so that's the way it stood for quite a while. His mother's name is Helena. I notice when I go down, what is that street that goes by Holly Road? One of those, there's a Catholic church over there. It says St. Helena Catholic Church or something. Well, you know, that's who it's named after, is the mother of Constantine. It's thought by most historians that Helena was a legit, deep follower of Jesus, loved the Lord. And so she took a large entourage of people and went to the Holy Land, went to Israel. And she went and identified various historical locations, a lot of which has been largely abandoned, kind of untouched. And so she went in there, and one of the things she identified was the location of the resurrection tomb. And there were a number of other things that she did. There's some kind of question about some of the stuff she came up with, like she supposedly found the real cross of Jesus. All three crosses were down in a kind of underground basement, so these have got to be it. Let's see if they really are. Maybe you'll get healed if you touch one, this kind of thing. So she was a mystic too, but she really genuinely, nobody questions it, she genuinely loved the Lord. And so she really did history a favor by identifying many historical places in Israel that had to do with Jesus. And the tomb was just one of them, was one of the magnificent identifications. And by the way, have any of y'all ever been to the tomb of Jesus in Israel? It's unrecognizable, as you know, and it's very disappointing because it's got all this archaic, Crusade era buildings on it, and Middle Age buildings, and all kinds of strange architecture. And you go in there and you have to wait in line forever and ever and ever. The problem is the tomb has been demolitioned numerous times. There are certain groups, Muslims and different ones, a general of Rome that came in and said, we want to wipe out any memory of this thing. Let's just raise this thing. And so the tomb was pretty battered, but there was enough left of it. On the bottom part of it was left, but the roof and all that was all torn off. And so that's what we have today, and that's why it's so odd. So recently they did, National Geographic did an exploration. Because pilgrims were starting to come by that time in such huge numbers, they were afraid that they were going to damage the laying place of the body in the tomb. And so they put marble over it. And they used some testing recently to see if the clay that was used, the mortar that was used, they can tell by certain types of measurements that when it was last exposed to sunlight. And it turns out the last time that mortar was exposed to sunlight was like 320 AD. So it correlates exactly with Helena coming and trying to protect some of these areas. Pretty interesting. So next we have the Council of Nicaea, which has a lot of bad press. But the Council of Nicaea was inspired by Constantine, but it was not run by Constantine. So the church leaders in that whole Mediterranean area, including North Africa and all these areas, came together, and there were some issues they needed to address. Remember, 325, we're only like 15 years into this thing now. And so all these church leaders came together, and one of the main issues they had to deal with was, what do we do with all of the believers during the reign of Diocletian that denied Christ? They were now elders and leaders and bishops and priests. And so the council met together and said, what do we do with these guys? Now, a lot of people, they tell you, if you find it online, somebody will say, well, that's where they decided what the books of the Bible were going to be. It had nothing to do with that. That's all just bad press. They already knew what the books of the Bible were, the New Testament. They already knew because it was decided by the people, by the circulation and who the authorships were and all that. It was already really understood. There was no council needed to decide. Everybody knew. It was by consensus. Really interesting how the New Testament came together in that way. So that was significant. But the Council of Nicaea, and would you want to guess how they voted, how they decided, what are we going to do with all these guys that they considered to some extent to be traitors and weak and cowardly, and what are we going to do with them? Do we take them out of leadership? Do we excommunicate them? What do we do with these people? Anybody want to guess what they did? So she's right. They decided that Jesus would want them to forgive them. And so they re-embraced all of these people that had in some way or another compromised, and they retained their place of their positions, their roles in the church. And it was really an amazing decision. There were some other things they addressed too, the Arian heresy, which was denying the deity of Christ. So by that time, the consensus among church leaders was that Jesus was God who came in the flesh. They were already really clear about that, but there were all kinds of splinter movements always kind of biting at the heels of the early church, and so they dealt with that. Those a couple of big things. So time goes by, another generation or two, and we get to 380 AD. At this time now, the Roman Empire declares Christianity as its state church. This is probably not good. But I can tell you, for all the ones that lived through Diocletian, they had a reprieve. They probably had 50 years where they had peace. And they could function. They could function under protection from the state. They probably had a relatively peaceful, wonderful period that lasted maybe 50 years or so. And it really lasted on from that. But what happened is they began to morph as they began to become more merged in with the state and state interests. And the church began to get more power and more money. More corruption came into the church. And so you can see that little document there on the things that were introduced into the... So this is the advent of the Catholic, what we know now to be the Catholic Church. Okay? So they have morphed. They are no longer what we think of as the early church, which I think of as more of a pure movement. But notice that all these things that were introduced, starting in 310 AD, were all introduced after the era of the early church. The early church was really orthodox. Their beliefs were almost identical to our beliefs today. They believed in free will. I mean, I can give you references of quotes from every church father leading up to the time of Constantine that believed in the doctrine of free will in the Bible. They were emphatic about it. They did not believe in infant baptism. They started doing infant baptism by the mid-3rd century. But it was not adamant. It was not instituted. It was not... Up until Constantine, they expected adults to get baptized. That's what their practice was. That's what they did. But by the time we get to, was it 418, the Council of Carthage, they instituted infant baptism. So by that time, it shifted from a kind of a rare exception. Maybe it's not so bad. Some of the church leaders were speaking against it, even as late as the mid-3rd century. But so this idea of infant baptism came from the idea that babies are born sinners. The early church never believed that. So it goes into kind of a doctrine of original sin, which I'm a little bit in a minority as far as how I see it. But the fact is that early church, the period we're talking about, the first almost 300 years, they did not see babies as born sinful. They saw them as born innocent. And that's really how we see it today. But that's what's the motivation behind institutionalizing baptism and babies. Now, it may not sound very important to you right now, but it becomes a life and death belief system. Do you believe in baptizing babies or not? And that becomes a big deal later, but it all is set in motion right in here. Augustine, who is referred to by the Catholics as Saint Augustine, Augustine of Hippo, you see him there in the list. He was born in 452 AD, died in 430 AD. Augustine, man, I do not see him as a saint. But in his early life, his theology was nearly identical with the early churches we've been just discussing. But as he was later in life, he shifted on some major points. So I'm giving you a little introduction because we're going to get into election and sovereignty and free will and all of that in the next few weeks. I'll probably have to do a part 2 on the history because I'm going to run out of... There's no way I can do all the history in my rambling style this evening. So Augustine shifted in his view, and it all pivoted around how he saw sovereignty, how he defined sovereignty. So the way it worked in his mind was, if God is sovereign, then he must be in control of everything. And so if he's not in control of everything, then he cannot be sovereign. And it all goes to the heart of how you define sovereign. And so in his later years, he actually denied free will. Well, you have to realize the Calvinist concepts of sovereignty and election and free will, all of that came from Augustine. Augustine was loved by the imperial powers because they liked the idea that people are elected to get saved and not elected, or, in other words, it's not their choice, it's God's choice arbitrarily to choose who will be saved and who will not. And the state government, the government loved that because they felt like it gave them the backing they needed to be able to force people to do things. Well, if God's forcing all these people to do things, we can do the same thing, and we're the hand of God. And so there was a nice dovetail there. So where there was disagreement in the church at that time, and there was much disagreement with Augustine, he ended up being kind of codified in his beliefs because the government loved him. He was a Catholic monk, one of the early Catholic monks. But he was also the first Catholic monk, the first Christian leader ever to advocate persecuting fellow Christians in a capital way. So the Donatists was a group in North Africa, very dedicated, but they actually theologically agreed with the Catholic Church at that time. They actually agreed with them theologically, but the thing that Augustine and some of the other church leaders objected to about the Donatists was how dare they deny being Catholic. And so they felt like it was an act of love to force them back in, that they were wayward, they were off track. And so the scripture they used was when Jesus said, go to the highways and byways and compel them to come. Okay? So they used that scripture. Augustine was the first one to do it. He used the phrase, we must compel them to come in. Just like Jesus used the phrase in the parable, which had nothing to do with how they were using this verse. We're talking about how to interpret the Bible. This is a classic misinterpretation. So that phrase, compel them to come in, the Donatists were adamant. We're not. You can kill us all. We don't care. We're not coming. We're not going to be Catholics. And they were even in their building. They said, we'll burn ourselves alive rather than be Catholics. I mean, they were really, really unmovable. And so Augustine advocated the persecution of his fellow Donatist Christians in North Africa. So from then on, that became the rationale used in the Catholic Church to support the Inquisitions, which came to fruition a few hundred years later. And so it's kind of a diabolical thing, and that's why when I hear people all the time, you hear people, oh, Saint Augustine this, Saint Augustine that, and I'm sitting there going, this man is no saint. He had his own agenda, and he became political, and he was favored by the powers that be, compel them to come in. So moving on through history, I'll make sure we have time for you all to comment. All right, the fall of the Roman Empire is usually by most historians considered to be 476 AD. That's the Western division of Rome. Remember, Rome is divided in East and West. The East continued on for a while, but the West was the main Roman Empire, and it collapsed to a great extent in 476 AD, even though they declared themselves Christian, 100 years before. But all of this is leading to the rise of the institutional Catholic Church, who began to fill the power void. It's generally considered that marks the beginning of the Middle Ages, which carried on until the 15th century. So once this happened, Rome left a huge void. Then there were new empires that rose, and new kings and new rulers, and this and that, and civil wars and battles, and boundaries moving and shifting, and realignments, empires that would come and go. Nothing was stable like the Roman Empire. So here's what's, I think, the saddest thing when we talk about the Middle Ages is the Catholic Church adopted a policy, and it's not clear exactly when. We know when they codified it. We know that in the early 1100s or so, they were actually in writing stating that the Bible is restricted from the common man, from the layman. They're not allowed to use the Bible or have or be in possession of a Bible, and it could be punishable. They could be subjected to the inquisitors and tortured, and it was really an awful scenario, but they did not want the Bible in the hands of the common people. And they certainly did not want a non-Latin version in the hands of the common people. So when we saw the little clip earlier, and Martin Luther was translating the Bible, in his Greek knowledge, he could translate it to German so the common man could read it. And that was a very powerful movement that started to take place even before the printing press. So the Middle Ages begin. And so for about 600 years, at least, the Catholic Church was suppressing the free access to the Scriptures. So the people were left in darkness. And that's so sad. And you just imagine the amount of darkness that they had to be in, and any amount of hope or light or clarity they weren't allowed to get. They had no access to the Bible. And if they did, they could be punished severely for it. It's almost hard to imagine that type of severe censorship with really a book that was meant to be for all people. So in the Middle Ages, we get to Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He built his dynasty from 768 to 813. Charlemagne, this is the guy that gave Christians a bad name. The other thing I want to clarify, we're talking about the Catholic Church as it develops and morphs. And you see all this junk that they adopt, one thing after another, year after year after year, all this non-biblical stuff. They essentially become a pagan religion. In my opinion, they have now left the Scriptures to such a great extent that they have essentially morphed into something entirely different. Even though organizationally we can follow them from Constantine, we can follow them from the early church in a structural way, but in a spiritual way they become lost. They have a structure in place, but no spirit, no heart, no fear of God, no sense of being rooted in love for God. It's all become political and powerful, and it's really sad. And then to keep the people in the dark was, I think, the worst thing. So enter Charlemagne, who came in as a Christian ruler, but he was ruthless. And to this day, he's thought of as one of the unifying forces of Europe, modern Europe as we know it today. Charlemagne, by force, unified Europe. And guess who his greatest admirers are? Hitler and Napoleon. Because of the way he did it by brute force. And he did it in league with the Catholic Church. They sanctified him in 800 AD as the emperor of the new Holy Roman Empire. And you know, his brute force was really harsh. You've probably heard the phrase, well, they were forced to be converted by the point of the sword. Well, he's the one that did it. And when they were taking over the realm of the Saxons, they literally in at least one location, they killed 4,500 Saxons because they were refusing to become Christians. 4,500 at the point of the sword, convert or die. All in the name of the Catholic Church. All in the name of Christ. All in the name of supposedly Christianity. When it had nothing to do with Christianity. So what we have is an imposter religion taking the place of the true faith. And I believe in all this time there's remnants. There's individuals who love God, and they're seeing that this isn't right. And that's where you begin to see the reformers surface. Let's see, how are we doing? I can go just a little bit further. So 1000 AD, it was the beginning of the Middle Ages, no longer as dark. It was a time of great innovation. They were inventing all kinds of stuff. This is like the precursor of the Reformation. I mean, it's like the people are awakening. There's a experimentation with democracy and certain cities, and it's kind of an interesting period, but they invented eyeglasses at that time. Eyeglasses. I think, what would my life be without eyeglasses? You see, that's such a huge invention because people's lives could then remain productive after nightfall. And so it changed the industry of the entire civilization by the fact that they had now a way to read in dim light or to do work with their hands or whatever it happened to be. They invented the paddle wheel. In other words, the way they started using the paddle wheel to drive mills and things like that in Europe was very innovative. The printing press was invented, as we're going to talk about probably next week. The refinement of gunpowder. Yes, the Chinese had gunpowder, but the Europeans in the Middle Ages, they took gunpowder and they made it into something else, let me tell you. So they started using it to develop artillery pieces and stuff. I mean, so 1054 is considered the great schism in the Catholic Church, East and West. So the Catholic Church split. The Western Roman Catholic Church split from the Eastern Orthodox Church, which now are two huge, giant, megalithic religions. And they split over political differences. Each side, the popes on each side are excommunicating each other. It's like, fine, okay, we're done. We're out of here. They were fighting over celibacy of the priests. The Eastern Orthodox didn't believe in celibacy of the priests. The priests all wanted their women. And the Roman Catholics, for whatever reason, said, we don't want our women. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And then the idols, how do we treat idols? What are we going to do with the idols? Communion technicalities, lots of communion technicalities. And so they split, and they've been split ever since. 1054, no going back. Then we enter the Crusades from 1095 to 1291, all done in the name of Christianity. I believe initially the Crusades were a defensive maneuver against the incursion of the Muslims, who were also ruthless. And I think it eventually morphed into, we've got to take Jerusalem back, we've got to do this, and it just became kind of a sad thing that unfolded over time. But I think the initial response when the Muslims came into Spain and started taking some of the lands of Europe, I think it alarmed the Europeans in general. And so they began to mobilize the Catholic Church, mobilize the Crusades, and that went on for years. To this day, you can go to Jerusalem and see architecture and things left by the Crusaders. 1200 to the early 1800s is roughly when the Inquisitions took place. And the Inquisitions are just one of those horrible, awful things the Catholic Church today doesn't really want to talk about. They want to minimize it. They want it to go away. We don't want to talk about that. But the fact is, the inquisitors were very feared. They were very ruthless. There was no due process. People were accused by a neighbor in anonymity. And, you know, some of these things are probably the reason we put in our own laws certain protections from that kind of thing. So I'm going to stop right here. And if you guys have comments, so we're up to about 1200, moving into the 1300s. So next week we'll go into the Reformation, kind of where that takes us into the revival awakening period. So any thoughts you guys have? We can run a mic. And Chris, you want to run the mic? Anybody has a comment? We're streaming this, so if we can record you, that'd be great. People can hear you.
You reference in 476 the fall of the Roman Empire, which led to the rise of the institutional Catholic Church. What is institutional Catholic Church?
Well, I guess what I meant was that the Catholic Church became far more developed over time. In other words, it's on a trajectory since Constantine took over. But I think that the first 50 or 60, 70 years, it probably still resembled a lot the early church. But by the time we see Augustine and his way of thinking, the Catholic Church is well established. By 418, they've instituted baptism of babies. So you have to realize, for a while there was the exception, the once in a while exception, and now in 418 or whatever year that was, they're now instituting it as the way to get saved. Babies have to get baptized, and if you don't baptize them, they're going to hell. I mean, it's that simple. So you better baptize that baby. If you don't, they die. It's on you, parent. And they taught it. They believed it. They pushed it. So they abandoned adult baptism. It's very sad. So they've abandoned the New Testament. And all of these things have abandoned the New Testament. And I look at this and I sit there and go, the Catholic religion is a false religion, ladies and gentlemen. The only thing they've got right is they've got life right. And they've got the deity of Christ right. But even that they've got all messed up because they got Mary usurping him. So anyway, go ahead, Jared.
So I was going to ask, you're talking about Charlemagne and how he was doing the convert or die stuff. and there was the Crusades with the Muslims and Islam particularly. Is the difference, because I don't know where in the Bible they came up with the idea, you said the compel them to come part is where that kind of tied into that. Is Islam ever going to actually be peaceful like they say they're going to be, or is that something straight out of their Quran or whatever that is the whole convert or die stuff? Like, is it a similar path? Like, how did that transpire between both those?
Okay, the convert or die part was something Charlemagne did during his reign. I don't know if the Muslims ever did that. I mean, yeah, they probably, actually they did do that, but I don't know. But it was all just brute force tyranny. It was just autocratic dominance and power and taking land and territory and whatever price people had to pay for them to get it. And both sides had that problem. We have that problem today, by the way.
Two questions. I haven't really studied the fall of the Roman Empire. So the first question is, why does such an advanced, powerful machine like the Roman Empire implode? And then the second question to that is, you have this 300-year gap between 476 and 768. Who's running the place? I mean,
Well-
was it the Catholic Church that was actually doing the management of the people? I mean, who was?
Yeah. Well, the Catholic Church did become much more powerful, filling the void. But there were other kingdoms that were rising up to fill those areas. And so, I mean, very substantial kingdoms. So it's not like the void remained. There were many people groups that subdivided, and then they would get their own rulers, and they would try to take more land, and it went back and forth for a while. But they imploded. You could have to Google it's been a while since I've read it, but it was a gradual thing. They were, was it Hannibal that came in from the north with the elephants and attacked Rome? Is that how you remember it? Here, Mike.
The Germanic tribes.
Yeah, let's get the mic on you.
Like a really a big question.
Yeah.
That's a really great question, but it's just one of those big, broad questions. Like, I think the first one was right about the fall, right? That you asked about the fall of Rome. And that's such a fascinating question to ask because, I mean, it kind of, there's a lot of echoes to what's actually happening a little bit now. Yeah, because like you could talk about inflation. That was a big issue. They were overextended. And they actually
Huge amounts of corruption.
And they debased their coinage. So like over time,
Yes.
you could look at the amount of precious metals in their coins that goes down. And then also, there's a whole decline of a belief in Rome. So they conscripted these Germanic tribes into their military over time. And so those Germanic tribes actually eventually are going to come in and conquer Rome itself, even though at one point they basically hired the Germans to fight for them. But that other point about the end, you have these different kingdoms, as you're talking about, Glenn. Like you've got the Franks, and then you've got the Ostrogoths, and you've got all these different kingdoms that are divided up.
Yeah.
But it's a really fascinating point about how it falls, because it takes a long time.
It took a long time.
Yeah, like even during
It probably
Diocletian.
was a 200-year period of decline, right?
Yeah, Diocletian on. I mean, it's on this slow decline.
Yeah.
And you've got this constant pressure from these Germanic tribes to the north. I know that doesn't
Constant
really relate
pressure.
to the
Relentless pressure.
Yeah, and that doesn't really totally relate to these religious issues that we're dealing with, but it's a really fascinating thing
Yeah.
to bring up. But yeah, it's
And Derek, by the way, is a historian, so his
we
his
can
input is
talk-
helpful.
Well, and it's really interesting that you bring this up because unfortunately, religion is such an important part of all this, and I would argue that sadly it probably doesn't get discussed enough. That's the problem because we live in there's such a secular environment, but for the people back then, they were all deeply spiritual. Either they were paganistic, or they were once Islam spreads, or you have Islam, you have Christianity, but there's these deep curiosity about the spiritual realm. And that's what's kind of weird about living in the time that we live in, is that you have this conflict. So many people that don't, an atheistic point of view, that
Yeah.
always when dealing with. But hopefully that made some sense.
Yeah,
That
thank
was
you.
really good.
It's very
good
helpful.
questions. And that concept of jihad with Islam too, that was something.
I think one of the things that's really remarkable is that Christianity, starting as a persecuted sect, often on the run, actually ends up essentially taking over the Roman Empire to some extent. I mean, I don't think they were running it, but they won. They won the battle of ideas in the end, and that ends up leads to their own downfall, is them becoming integrated into the governmental system. And, you know, there's a reason we have jurisdictional separation today. But anyway, somebody else? Yeah, Jaron.
Okay, back to the subject of original sin. Now, I know you're going to dive into it more in the coming weeks, but you talked about original sin and baptizing babies, and that if a baby is not baptized, people were being taught that the non-baptized baby was going to hell.
Right.
And then you also talked a little bit about how they got weird about the deity of Christ. How did they reconcile the deity of Christ with original sin? Because Christ was born. If all babies are born with original sin, how could Christ have been fully God and fully man?
They knew that was a problem. That's why they came up with the doctrine of immaculate conception.
Okay. Got it.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a chessboard here, but they realized that was a problem. It took them a few hundred years to figure it out, but they realized, okay, so Mary's going to have to be pure too. And then was it 1950? They did one final one, the Ascension of Mary, where she raises from the dead just like Jesus. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's a false Christ, clearly. But yeah, that's how they get around that. Yeah, and the Scripture says Jesus had the likeness. It didn't say he had the likeness of human flesh. It says he had the likeness of sinful flesh. Jesus was born in the likeness of sinful flesh, tempted as we are. So, yeah, anyway.
If you could just explain a little bit about the Crusades. I'm not very knowledgeable about it. The only thing I do know is that in...
Derek is shaking his head. It is a sad ending when they take the kids and the kids go over there and what's the seventh crusade where the children go? Oh, it was awful.
Well, in
yeah. So which...
in the churches in England and Scotland, if the tombs are in the churches, in the cathedrals, and if the leader or whoever's buried, if his legs are crossed, like they make a statue above his tomb. So if his legs are crossed, he fought in the Crusades. And if his legs are straight, he did not. And I found that fascinating. And I'm just wondering, what is this connection? I just don't know much.
And then there's the Knights Templar and that whole mess. These super dedicated special force guys, and because they became a threat to the power base, they wiped them out. The kings, the rulers, they wiped them out, and then they escaped. A lot of them escaped, got in their ships, but they were rich. But they fought nobly in the Crusades. Yeah. Anybody else? We've got another minute. Yeah, I was concerned y'all would spin off on the history stuff and leave me because. What was her question? About the crossed legs? What was the question that I'm not going to answer?
I just don't know much about the Crusades. Just kind of like a general synopsis or summary.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, in just a synopsis, we've kind of summarized it, but yeah, the European Union, the alignment of, and is very motivated by the Catholic. But remember, the Catholic Church was oftentimes in alignments with the kings and the monarchs and so forth. And so they would create these pacts. And so together they worked out an agreement, at least for the First Crusade. And I don't know how it followed, but like I said initially, the Muslims just rose out of nowhere. They became a very powerful force to be reckoned with, and they were ruthless. And they were taking land, and they wanted to take land right and left, and they were taking Spain. It concerned them. And so they said, we need to mobilize a defensive, and I really believe initially it was a defensive maneuver. So not only we need to push them out, we need to push them out of Europe and push them out of Spain and all these other places, but we also need to push them out of Jerusalem, because that's the holy city. And so they went and they took them out over Jerusalem. The battles were awful, they were bloody, they were merciless. There was all kinds of stories that go with that, but But nonetheless, the Crusaders would take sections of Israel and they would hold it. Sometimes for 50 years or whatever. They would hold it for a long time, and they would do construction projects and build all kinds of things. They rebuilt some of the walls of Jerusalem. So some of the walls that you see now were built by the Crusaders. And so then the Muslims would come back and they chase them off and they go, oh, we lost. And so they'd have to go back and regroup and then come for a new crusade, and they'd have to get funds, they'd have to get everybody in alignment, and they'd get another crusade together and go down and try to take Jerusalem again. And it went back and forth like that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I tried in a fumbling way. Okay. Let's see where we're at time-wise, 8:31. Oh, okay. Was it Dan? Okay.
Talking about that, correct me if I'm wrong, but because of the Crusades, the Catholic Church was trying to eke more money out of everybody, which kind of played into what happened with Luther and some of the others in standing against all this corruption eventually. Or
Yeah, that whole idea of the Crusades is a complicated thing. Because
It really is.
like Glenn was saying, it lasts a couple hundred years. And what's kind of interesting too, to go along with what Glenn was saying, is these knights were warriors, and they would fight with each other all the time. So one thing, it's kind of sadly comical, I could say, was to get them out of Europe and fight somebody else, because I know that sounds funny and kind of strange, but they were, they were constantly at war with each other because Europe was decentralized.
King Arthur and Lancelot.
It was all feudalistic. So, one way to get rid of all that political instability is
Yeah.
to go fight somebody else. And, we just, I think Glenn's really made the point, about this idea of all this violence. Because, the Germanic peoples, one of the ways that you obtained loyalty was to go and take things from other people. So, if you think about these Anglo-Saxons and all these Germanic peoples, it wasn't like, you go to college and get a degree. No, you go conquer somebody and take their stuff. And the way you get loyalty is to conquer other people and get their stuff. Because that's kind of, on Beowulf, you look at Beowulf, that's kind of how it is. So, in the Vikings later. So it's really disturbing for us,
It's amazing that Western civilization actually appeared.
Yeah. It's just so hard for us to get, because I think it's, we live in a world of just such like agricultural surplus and comforts.
Yeah.
But to live in a world where you're literally just, a couple meals away, or the grain going bad to starvation, it's just hard for us to imagine.
And boy, they had epidemics too.
Yes.
Gosh.
Yes, absolutely.
The Black Plague.
And that's, yeah. So it's just such a violent, brutal, and there's obviously examples of peace, but I think like the point you're making about the instability and the violence and we're very lucky very blessed to have
Yes.
to have what we have.
No kidding. It's true. All right. Well, let's go ahead and it's 8:33, trying to stick with an hour here, and appreciate your comments and hope you found this interesting. I saw a couple people dozing off. History is not everybody's history is not everybody's thing. Ironically, I've learned to love history, but when I was in college and high school, I really had a distaste for it. It was a struggle. But now I just dive into it and read, and I even enjoy preparing for things like this. But even while I'm preparing, I realize that there's so many avenues I could go in, reread and reinvestigate, and I'm like, oh my goodness. And I try to stay pretty informed, but history is so vast and complicated, and there's so many avenues. Oh, today's politics. What are they doing? Yeah, exactly.